Welcome to Infamous Maximus.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today on my first ever episode on this channel. My name is
Infamous Maximus.
and I'm going to be your personal gladiator for information and entertainment. But anyways, I should probably put this all down before I hurt somebody. So anyway, if many of you are like me, you probably went to school and learned a little bit about George Washington. Maybe you heard a story about him chopping down a cherry tree. Maybe you learned about him crossing a frozen river to win a battle during the Revolutionary War. Maybe you were taught about him being the first president. I'm sure you've all seen his face on our currency too. You know, the $1 bill. It's everywhere, especially at some of my favorite establishments.
The fun zone.
So anyways, after getting out of school and learning those things and going on with life for a few years, I learned a few things about George Washington that
Blew me away.
I blow the wind of God. The wind of God.
So when I learned those things and I decided that I wanted to know more about George Washington, I did a little research and I found a really good book right here. I highly recommend it. I'm not being sponsored in any way by Mr. Ron Chernow. Sorry if I butcher your name. But I just think it's a really great book. That's where I got a lot of my information from, a lot of quotes that I'll be reading throughout this video as well as the future videos that I make on George Washington. So highly recommend it. If you have the time to read it, great. Absolutely go get a copy, pick it up, read it. If not though, that's what I'm here for. I've read most of the book, taken notes on it, and I'm gonna summarize it and try to put it together in a nice informative and entertaining package for you guys. So anyway, the first topic that I would like to cover is slavery. Basically, what was George Washington's stance on slavery? What were his beliefs regarding slavery? Not only what did he say, but what did he do when it came to slavery? This is the founding father, and I hear a lot of people say that America is the greatest country ever, and it was founded on these awesome principles of freedom and freedom for everybody and equality, and that's partially true, but to really understand the founding of America, what America really stands for, what the Constitution really stands for, it helps to know what the motives of the founding fathers are. So what better place to start than with our first president, George Washington. So with that, let's begin. All right, so the first fact or piece of information that I'd like to bring up is that George Washington was indeed a slave owner, meaning he owned other human beings as property from the time that he was a boy until the time that he died. In fact, when he was 11 years old, his father died, and he inherited over 20 slaves from his father, which I just kind of want to pause on for a second. The thought of being somebody else's slaves, being somebody else's property at all, period, is terrifying. I would hate that. But just think about what if you were in the position, you're a grown individual or whatever, and you become all of a sudden the property of an 11-year-old boy. Now, I don't know if you know any 11-year-old boys or any teenage boys and the imaginations they can have, but that would be absolutely terrifying. That just scares me. But anyways, moving on. Washington goes on through life, grows up, gets a job. He works as a surveyor. He works in the British Army before the American Revolution. He is able to get some money with which he buys more land, and then buys more slaves, and then buys more land and buys more slaves. And eventually, when he's 26, he marries a woman named Martha Dandridge Custis, who was a very wealthy widow. Now talk about a sugar mama, because Martha was loaded. So when George Washington married her, he inherited thousands of acres of land as well as about 300 slaves. 300 slaves. That's like a small army. And George Washington used that small army of slaves 6 days a week from sunup till sundown to help him build and renovate his mansion at Mount Vernon. Not only that, but he had them tend the crops, herd the cattle, and make that money. So George Washington was a good old plantation owner, just like many of the Confederate officers whose statues people have been tearing down recently. And by the way, Washington remained a slave and plantation owner until the day he died. Anyways, that's it for fact number 1. All right, so the second point that I'd like to bring up is that George Washington was a great politician. And like many other great politicians, he had a propensity to not always tell the truth and to dodge certain questions and to tell people what he thought they wanted to hear. And when it came to slavery, he did this on numerous occasions. One example is when a man named Tobias Lear was applying for a job at Mount Vernon. Mr. Lear here, he was a Harvard graduate, I believe. He was a smart man. And he was coming to help out George Washington do some paperwork as well as tutor his kids. And he wanted the job, but it said that he expressed one reservation, and that was that he abhorred slavery, right? And it says that only when Washington declared his ultimate intention to free his slaves, and also said that meanwhile the slaves would be better off in Washington's care anyways than as free people, did Lear decide to take the job. So Washington basically, Lear's like, oh, I want to work for you, but I don't know, I'm not really cool with the slavery thing. And Washington's like, oh, you know what, neither am I. I absolutely hate slavery, even though I own like 300 of them. Absolutely hate it, and I'm totally going to get rid of it one of these days. Someday in the future. I'm not really going to put a date on it, because I'm making money off of them right now, but totally going to get rid of it. And I mean, anyways, these poor helpless slaves are going to be so much better in my care than anywhere else right now. So it just makes sense to leave things as they are right now, And Tobias Lear, supposedly a smart guy, he bought it. I don't, but that's just me. Anyways, that's one example. Another example is there was a man named Lafayette, who was a guy who came from France to help the Americans fight the British in the Revolutionary War. And he and Washington became very, very close. But Lafayette absolutely hated slavery, and so he wrote George Washington a letter with an idea. He was saying, you know what, slavery is a bad thing. We got to get rid of it. And I have an idea. You're a very influential man. So what we can do is maybe we can buy some land and we can put the slaves on it, and you can use them as renters. Well, Washington's response to this, reading out of this book, what Washington wrote back was, "The scheme, my dear Marquis, which you propose as a precedent to encourage the emancipation of the black people of this country, is a striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart. I shall be happy to join you in so laudable a work, but will defer going into detail of the business till I have the pleasure of seeing you." So basically what he's saying here is oh, Lafayette, you have a big heart. This is just so nice of you just to want the best for these people, and we'll totally talk about it when I see you in person. Even though you live in France, I live in America, I don't have any plans on seeing you, but we'll totally talk about it. We'll totally talk about it when I have the time and we meet in person. So again, here he is, hearing the issue and choosing not to do anything about it, not to even really engage in the conversation, because he knows, I'm sure he knew on some level that he was never going to give up slavery, because that's how he was making his money and he didn't want to give it up. So, he chose, he could have chosen a good cause, end slavery, or at least set an end slavery for himself and set the example, or he could have chose to go for the money, and he chose the money, and he did so repeatedly throughout his life. When people would ask him this question, he would dodge the issue, And yeah, so that's number 2. All right, so story number 3 takes place at the end of the Revolutionary War after the British Army had surrendered to the colonists. And George Washington was negotiating terms of surrender and evacuation with a British man named Sir Guy Carleton. Now, at this time, a lot of the British troops were in New York State, and they were planning, like I said, they were planning to evacuate. And another issue that they were having, and one of the things that came up in the negotiations, was the fact that there was about 3,000 runaway slaves who had ran away from their masters in the colonies, and they had fled behind British lines for protection. And a lot of these runaway slaves, they were set up in camps and tents, and they were trying to board British ships because they knew that if they could get on board a British ship, it might take them to, over to Great Britain or to Canada, where these slaves could get away from their masters for good. Now, at the same time, there were also bounty hunters that had been hired by masters in the South and across the colonies, trying to come and get their slaves back. So there were literally people who had been paid to recapture these runaway slaves, and they were going into these tents at night where the runaway slaves were hiding out, and they were dragging people out of their beds and just taking them back to what must have been a horrible fate. I can only imagine the terror that was going through these camps and the panic that must have been, these people must have been experiencing as they're trying to run away to freedom. So basically, during this time, you have all this chaos going on, people trying to run away, and you have Washington on one side and Sir Guy Carleton on the other, negotiating over the fate of these runaway slaves. So I'm just going to read from this book real quick. It says, even though one article of the peace treaty stipulated that Americans would be allowed to reclaim their slaves, Carleton balked at relinquishing these black refugees, claiming they had won their freedom when they reached British lines. To buttress this ruling, he issued 3,000 certificates to protect the former slaves, making it a crime for anyone to abduct them. Washington, however, said he intended to take possession of all Negroes and other property of the inhabitants of these states being held by the British. When Carleton retorted that he had just evacuated 6,000 people from New York to Nova Scotia, many of them black, well, Washington was mad. He was very unhappy about this. Going on to read here, seizing the moral high ground, the Honorable Carleton insisted that the British would not renege on wartime promises to free slaves who had joined their ranks, and stated with memorable certitude that national honor must be kept with all colors. Returning former slaves would be delivering them up, some possibly to the execution and others to severe punishment, which in his opinion would be a dishonorable violation of the public faith pledged to the Negroes in the proclamations. So, again, right here, you have two sides. You have the British Guy Carleton, Sir Guy Carleton, and then you have General Washington, right? And they're doing these negotiations over what's going to happen to all these runaway slaves. And Sir Guy Carleton here is, like I said, we view in history, we grow up thinking that the English were overbearing and tyrannical, but here he is helping out the slaves escape to freedom, versus and he understands that what's going to happen to him. He understands what's going to happen when the bounty hunters, they come and they take these slaves who have run away, they've disobeyed their masters are pissed, right? And he understands what's going to happen to him when they go back to their masters, understands that many of them might be killed, might be tortured. And, so he's sticking up for these people and helping them escape to freedom, versus Washington, who is supposedly the great proponent of freedom and equality. It's one of the things that he said he was fighting for in the Revolutionary War. He absolutely knows what's going to happen to these people when they go back home, and yet he is mad that they're escaping, and he wants them back. What kind of person, knowing that these people are going to be tortured and beaten when they go back to their plantations? What kind of person would fight for that? And not only on like a political level, but like he was mad that they were escaping. What does that say about Washington as a person, and especially as a person when it comes to slavery? Like that right there again blows my mind. Not exactly what we were taught in world history or American history. So anyways, I just wanted to use this example and point out kind of the irony in the situation and how things that we were taught may not always be the realities, or at least not the realities for everyone. Washington did help bring certain freedoms to certain groups of people, but yet at the same time he was still very much a proponent of slavery for African people. But yeah, that's about it. That's the end of story number 3. All right, so number 4 here. This ties into what we were just talking about with those runaway slaves in New York and George Washington working on treaties and terms to get them back. Apparently, this was also a personal issue for George Washington because he had several slaves at that time that were runaways as well, and he was trying to get them back. In fact, there are letters and quotes from him where he told people that if they found any information about these slaves and or were able to detain them, that he really wanted them back. He wanted that information, or just whatever leads he could get, and or if they could actually physically detain the slaves and bring them back, he wanted them back. Yeah, so over his lifetime, George Washington he did have quite a few slaves run away. Some of them multiple times, but apparently there were 47 slaves in total that ran away. That's about 7% of his total slave population that ran away at one time or the other during his lifetime. And Washington apparently didn't use a lot of corporal punishments. He wasn't big on whipping. He would absolutely spend a lot of time getting his slaves back, or hunting them down, or trying to get other people to find his slaves for him. He was really big on that, and put a lot of effort into reclaiming runaway slaves. I couldn't find any evidence that he personally had any influence or wrote any of these laws, but the laws in Virginia and possibly other states were, let's just say, they would strike fear into a lot of slaves who were maybe considering running away. And let me read to you why. So in Virginia, regarding runaway slaves, this law says, "It shall be lawful for any person to kill or destroy such slaves by any ways or means, without accusation or impeachment of any crime for the same." So think about that. So this law specifically says that if there's a runaway slave and somebody catches them, that person can kill or destroy that slave any way they want to. If they want to chop off a finger at a time, then a limb, then whatever. If they want to burn them, if they want to beat them, then burn them. If they want to do any horrible thing you can think of, they legally could do that. And it says they wouldn't face accusation or impeachment. They wouldn't go to jail for killing a runaway slave any way they wanted to. That is absolutely horrible. And like I said, I didn't find any evidence that Washington personally wrote these rules. I don't know if they were there before him, but in Virginia, he was very wealthy. He was one of the social elites. He politically had a lot of influence from being a general, and he was also in politics and held several positions. So I'm sure he, even if he didn't write this law, he could have influenced laws to change it, but he didn't. He probably really appreciated these laws because he did not like his slaves running away. And like I said, he would go to great lengths to try and get them back when they did run away. One example is a story of a slave named Ona Oni Judge. She has an interesting story because she ran away when she was 20 years old. She actually found out that she was going to be given as a wedding gift to Martha's granddaughter, who apparently this granddaughter had a reputation for being pretty mean, having a bad temper. And so, I can understand her plight. Like, she, even if she had it supposedly good with George and Martha, the thought of going to a master with a bad temper, nobody wants that. So she ran away, and she made it up to New Hampshire, where she was eventually spotted by a friend of the Washingtons. Now, this friend told Washington about her, and Washington worked with, there was a guy named Joseph Whipple, who was a customs man. He was a collector of customs, and they're trying to get her back. And he was going to go through with it, maybe send people out there to get her. But he eventually backed off of that plan when he found out that abolitionists were going to possibly start riots in the street, and if he found out that if he had gone through and abducted her, that the abolitionists may have rioted, and he didn't want that. He also could have gone through the legal system, because there were laws in the place, which we'll talk about here in the next point. So he could have filed a lawsuit, but he didn't want it to become public. He just stopped because he didn't want the bad press. He was just like, I want her back, but it's probably not worth the trouble or the lawsuits or whatever. So he didn't end up going through with it at that time. However, in 1799, this is after he had retired from the presidency. He sent his nephew to travel up to New Hampshire to try and convince or persuade Oni to return back to him. So she's basically living as a free person up in New Hampshire, and he sent his nephew to be like, hey, we want you to come back to Virginia. You should definitely come back to Virginia and be a slave. And he even said he promised her that she would get her freedom when George and Martha died. So however long that would have been, I don't know. But Oni had just gotten married, and she had just given birth, so she had a newborn baby. Of course, she said no. Now, when Washington's nephew wasn't able to convince her to come back on her own, he actually had a plan where he was going to abduct her. He was going to kidnap her, take her off, and luckily, though, somebody tipped Oni off, and she was able to go into hiding and wasn't captured by Washington's nephew. Now, think about this for a second. This woman, she just got married. Now, think about anybody who just got married. They're in love, they get married. Took them. Often takes people a while to find a person they want to settle down with, and think of the happiness. She's just settled down. She's found her husband. Just had a baby with him. Has a newborn baby, and Washington is not only okay with, but has an active plan and enlists his nephew to kidnap a mother from her newborn baby. I don't know if he was going to take the baby. I mean, that is awful too. But to take a woman away from her newlywed husband and newborn baby and bring her back into bondage. That's terrible. And this is the George Washington that we are told all these wonderful stories about. One thing I forgot to cover real quick before we moved on. Something that surprised me was that George and Martha, they are supposedly wealthy, intelligent, politically elite people. He was a general. He led people. He was a businessman. He knew a lot about farming, a lot about politics. Smart man in a lot of ways, right? However, George and Martha, it says that they often felt shocked and betrayed when when their slaves ran away from them, especially the slaves that they considered favorites or the ones that they gave preferential treatment to. And this just kind of, I was going to say blows my mind again, but I feel like I've said that already so many times. But yeah, it blows my mind here also because here's the smart man. George Washington's very ambitious. He understands what personally understands what it's like to be ambitious, to not only want freedom, but to want social freedom, to be able to rise up, through the ranks economically and politically. That's why he went to war. So he understands that. He understands, he personally wanted to live a life of leisure and luxury, being able to tend his farm, doing what he wants to do every day. And yet, knowing all those things on a personal level, him and Martha they seem to not be able to understand why someone in bondage would want to run away when they supposedly had it so good at the Washington farm at Mount Vernon. To them, he thought he was such a good master, a good boss, a good whatever, treated these slaves so well that he couldn't understand why they would want to run away to freedom. Like, oh, why would you want to be free? I don't get it. It's crazy. That just there's just some things where you read it and you can understand it, understand that it was, but you can't really understand it. Like there's certain mental things or just situations where I'll never understand it. Like I'll never understand why people enjoy asparagus or other foods or things or certain types of music. Like I understand that they do, but I will never understand why they do. And for me, with George and George and Martha, I don't think I'll ever understand how they didn't understand this motivation. But anyways, there was one other quote I wanted to share on this topic. So going back to Oni Judge, when she was first in New Hampshire and Washington backed off that whole thing, trying to get her back because of potential riots. The collector, the customs guy there, his name was Joseph Whipple. And after Washington wasn't able to get Oni back, he wrote this to Joseph, and I'll just read it here. He says, "I regret that the attempt you made to restore the girl, Oni Judge, as she called herself while with us, and who, without the least provocation, absconded from her mistress, should have been attended with so little success." All right, so I'm going to stop there. So first of all, he says, she left without any provocation. Okay, you're a slave. What other provocation do you need? Like, is he trying to say that, like, oh, well, we don't see why she... Again, the whole mental thing. We don't understand why she left. We weren't, beating her senseless every day. It's like, come on, she's still a slave. You can't relate to her plight at all. And maybe he did. I don't know. Maybe he did understand it, and this is just his wording to make it sound like he was justified in trying to get her back. I don't know. But anyways, so should have been attended with so little success. To enter into such a compromise with her as she suggested to you is totally inadmissible, for reasons that must strike at first view. For however well disposed I might be to a gradual abolition, or even to an entire emancipation of that description of people, I'm just going to skip this. It would neither be politic or just to reward unfaithfulness with a premature preference of freedom. All right, so I'm just going to stop there and cover that part where he says, for however well disposed, to the freedom part. He's saying here that, while he's basically admitting that, well, I'm okay with a gradual emancipation, but how dare this girl run away? And she doesn't deserve it. It wouldn't be just of us to reward her with her freedom for running away. She needs to earn that freedom through basically us granting it to her with our rules and laws and whatever. So again, we talked about the story with Lafayette and with the guy who wanted to work at his house as a tutor, and how Washington told them, and there's several other places in history I'm sure you can find where Washington said he abhorred slavery and he was against it, and he eventually wanted to give them their freedom. Well, to me it kind of sounds like he economically maybe he's just trying to buy time until he dies, and then he can say, well, I'm a good guy because I put it in my will to give them their freedom. Meanwhile, benefiting from slavery, from slaves working for him for his entire life. So that way he can say and have it in the history book saying, oh, well, I'm against it. I'm eventually going to get rid of it, while at the same time maintaining his privilege and his economic stability that he was deriving from having slaves. Anyways, that's what it sounds like to me. And yeah, on to the next subject. All right, on to topic number 5. We are going to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. So I said earlier that I didn't know if Washington had any direct influence or wrote any of the legislation regarding the laws in Virginia, dealing with runaway slaves, but we do for sure know that he passed this Fugitive Slave Act himself. Well, with Congress too, but it was his second term in the presidency, and he saw that this became a bill and passed into legislation. So basically what this act said, this is going to be short and sweet. It said that slave owners could cross any state boundaries in pursuit of escapees. So I guess maybe that wasn't legal before. Maybe there were some technicalities, but he made sure that it was legal, gave slave owners rights to legally pass through any states on a manhunt for their runaway slaves. Not only that, but it gave a fine of $500, which was $500 was a lot of money back then. $500 to anyone who either sheltered or aided runaway slaves. For all his talk earlier with Lafayette and other people of how much he hated slavery, he passed this law, and this was a pretty strong, pretty pro-slavery law at that time. So totally the opposite direction of emancipation. Pretty telling right there as to George Washington's stance on slavery and the kind of person he was when it came to slavery. So kind of a question here, or something that I've been thinking about, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode is recently people have been talking about a lot of historical leaders, specifically a lot of Confederate leaders, and they've been tearing down monuments and doing all sorts of things because these men, they were slave owners and they fought a war, at least in part, to preserve slavery. So the question really I've been thinking is, what makes George Washington so different from, say, Robert E. Lee or some other historical figure who owned slaves? I mean, from what I studied here and what I've read here, it seems like they are very similar. So, I mean, and again, I'm not trying to influence anyone one way or the other on what action to take in this, but if we're going to tear down statues of, say, like Robert E. Lee and things like that, like does that mean that we are now going to or should tear down statues like the Washington Monument, or take George the Bounty Hunter's face off of our currency? Again, I'm not advocating anything. It's just interesting that one side is getting all the hate, while you don't really hear anything about other historical figures who are still idolized and even put on a certain pedestal. So just some food for thought. That's it. Anyway, I'd just like to say congratulations to all those who made it this far, and thank you so much for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed what you watched and the information that you were able to learn. If you did enjoy it, please hit the like and subscribe button. That would help out a ton. That helped me bring out more content and more information for you. And next time I will be covering some information on what it was like, what it may have been like to be a slave at Mount Vernon, what the living conditions might have been like, the working hours, all that interesting information. I was going to try and get into this video, but just didn't have the time, so it'll be in the next episode. Like I was saying, tune in next time for some more awesome information with us here at
Infamous Maximus.
And that's okay too. You know, if you want something quick and easy, I can assure you that I've been called both of those things on multiple occasions.